Hamas has claimed this week it will agree to a ceasefire deal with Israel intended to last 6 weeks. Will they stick to the agreement? Does it benefit Israel, Hamas, or both? And by the way, how did we get to this place anyway? Welcome, everyone, to our latest episode of Headlines in History with your host, me, John Molly. Thank you for joining me today, especially if this is your first time. But of course, can't forget thanks to all of you who are returning as well, who are joining me on this journey here. If you happen to miss the last episode, go ahead and check that out. That in it, we talked about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent trip to China and what that means for U.S. and China relations today and going forward. It's interesting that the U.S. is looking to increase the dialogue again with China after the so-called spy balloon incidents of last year. So take a look at the last episode, and we're going to dig into some of those details specifically on U.S.-China relations. So that would be our 8th. We're going to do our 9th today, and then 10th episode next week is going to be our first interview, and it's going to tie in rather nicely with last week's China episode, as we're going to talk to a senior military officer who happened to spend some time in the Horn of Africa in the last year, and how that relates to what China's doing in the region, and it'll play off really nice from episode 8. So go ahead and check out that episode. But this week, what I want to talk about is shifting back towards the Middle East and in what is pretty much the biggest foreign affairs story of the week, and that is, like I had said, the potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. This is, we did an episode on Iran's response to Israel after Israel killed some senior IRGC members in Damascus a few weeks ago, and how Iran responded and what their intentions were and what they were looking to accomplish. And now it looks as if Israel and Hamas may actually reach a ceasefire. At least that's what's being reported now. And obviously, we've discussed on the show in the past the connections between Iran and Hamas and how this whole thing ties together. So let's have a conversation about this potential ceasefire, and we'll dig a little bit into Hamas as an entity and what they are really quickly. We don't really have a lot of time this episode to go too deeply into their history, but we're going to talk real quickly and then kind of what's happened over the last 20-ish years that led to what we're dealing with today, and the fact, and why we're even in a position to be having ceasefire negotiations. So let me add, weekly caveat: although I remain in the business, I do not speak for the U.S. Army. I don't speak for the Department of Defense or the U.S. government in any way. All my opinions are my own, and I draw them from open source information only. So, okay, no ties to the Army in this format in any way. Now, to the topic. I did say the deal was potential, again, as of today, which is the evening of May 8th, because the most recent proposal is still being considered, specifically on the Israeli side, and it has yet to become quote-unquote official. Right? We originally heard a deal was on the table last week, but now we await final decisions and language. It looks as if the negotiations continued. Something was presented to the Hamas side of the house. It looked as if Hamas was able to agree, and then some changes were made. The deal was pushed back to Israel, and now Israel's in a position where they're deciding whether they want to accept this or not. Both parties have been negotiating these terms through interlocutors in Egypt and Qatar. As you might have guessed, right? They do not have diplomatic relations directly, similar to the United States and Iran and North Korea. They use these intermediaries. And Qatar happens to be one of the more important, specifically for two reasons. Qatar does this. They're kind of the Switzerland of the Middle East, if you will. But two, because the senior Hamas leadership actually resides in Qatar. They don't hang out in Gaza. Unfortunately, they reside and operate within Qatar, and so they have a direct connection to the Qataris there. So interesting, though, to me is the fact that earlier this week about Qatar, officials officials there revealed they are open to the idea of expelling the Hamas leadership I just talked about from Qatar at the Qatar. There's two different ways to say it. Choose your own at the U.S.'s request. So now this is a big deal because, like I said, like Qatar is kind of like the Switzerland of the Middle East, and they often don't get, if rarely at all, get involved in whatever the negotiations are. They kind of just they don't choose sides rarely and make a decision as to who's right and who's wrong. They kind of just act as the mediator. And the fact that the U.S. has asked specifically to expel Hamas leadership from Qatar says a lot. It really highlights the fact that it's most likely that Hamas is not acting in good faith, and Qatar knows this, right? It's if Qatar does give Hamas the boot, it sends a message that Hamas isn't negotiating in good faith. Now, my guess is the U.S. has pretty compelling intelligence indicating that fact, and that Qatar's being forced to accept that reality. Now, speculation on my part, but given history, seems the most logical. It certainly happened in the past. I would make the assumption that if Qatar was going to pull out, in the sense that they were going to boot Hamas, the intelligence the U.S. or their allies had to have to prove that Hamas is really not playing fair, if you will, would have to be pretty compelling, but and really difficult to wash over. But if it is true, Hamas may be in a position where they're going to have to find somewhere else to go. Hamas leadership, that is. Will they? Potentially. I mean, where else are they going to go? If you look back into the history of the most recent leadership of Hamas, they don't really want to live in Gaza, and that's for a whole nother discussion. But they'll likely find somewhere else to go if it does happen. But it says a lot nonetheless. At this juncture, as I said, the details have yet to be released. I'm sure we'll find out someday, but as you might expect, the discussions over the remaining hostages are really driving this thing. I did read this week that specific language was changed from, quote, 30 hostages, end quote, which is how many hostages Israel believes still remain in Hamas's custody in Gaza, to something like, quote, 30 hostages or their bodies, the bodies thereof, end quote, because Hamas cannot provide proof that these hostages remain alive. And that's pretty much a sticking point. The argument over the hostages is really what's driving the need for the talks. In my mind, Israel wouldn't even be at the table if the hostages were not in play, right? Netanyahu's government is trying to save as many Israeli lives as possible. Obviously, that's his job. And it's not just Israelis who are being held hostage. There were initially Americans as well and others. While also trying to eradicate Hamas, at least as a tactical fighting organization, from Gaza simultaneously. So Netanyahu is trying to do both things. If he didn't have the hostage thing to deal with, he didn't have that part of the conversation, I don't think there would be any negotiations at all, given the rhetoric that Prime Minister Netanyahu has used. We'll just have to see how this plays out. But for my money is on the fact that if the hostages, unfortunately, if they're no longer alive, Israel's just waiting for confirmation, and then all bets are off. Now, reports do indicate, as I said in the intro, that the ceasefire, if it's agreed upon, could potentially last 6 weeks, and this would allow for more humanitarian assistance to flow into Gaza, and then potentially to get the hostages, dead or alive, to get them out. Again, whatever remains of them. But operations by the IDF will still continue on some level. There won't be, again, and this is just some of the reporting that I've read, operations won't completely stop. We don't know what those details are. I mean, right now the negotiations are still ongoing, and Israel is slowly entering Rafah, the southernmost population center in Gaza, and the last real holdout area, if you will, of some of the senior Hamas fighters that remain inside Gaza. So, and as far as sticking points go, you can imagine that this is one for Hamas, right? If Hamas is going to agree to a six weeks ceasefire, one of the things that they want is a complete cessation of hostility. So, I mean, we'll see. Regardless of what happens with the deal, like I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear that his plan to clear Gaza of all Hamas militants is guaranteed. Right? We've talked about before on the show whether that's feasible or not. I don't, that's for a different matter. But either way, that's the claim that he's making, and we'll see if he's able to reach that end state or not. But that's ultimately his goal. Now, let me address really quick one thing that might be on your mind about intelligence gathering and Israel's ability to understand the battle space, which is probably what they would call Gaza, at least the military would during these operations. Okay, I bring this up to speak about the hostage situation specifically, but it should illuminate your understanding regarding military operations overall, because you might be saying to yourself, like, if Israel is such an advanced country militarily, at least, right, like the United States and Canada, Australia, the UK, right, France, Germany, if they're as advanced as they say they are, then why can't they just find all the hostages, go and get them in these buildings, and then pull them out, right? I mean, it seems obvious. Why would they even have to negotiate to bring these hostages back? So let's talk about that really quickly from a collection standpoint. Intelligence collection is an exceptionally challenging process. The primary reason is that there simply aren't enough assets to look for every piece of intelligence or evidence all the time, everywhere, right? That's true with wealthy countries with advanced technology, like I had mentioned, the US, Israel, whatever, that have tools like ground penetrating radar. I mean, we have LiDAR, which is basically laser technology to measure distance above ground. We have electro-optical cameras that we could look at from space with infrared, plenty of communications interception technologies. There's lots of stuff out there, right? So, some of the stuff that you see in the movies, some of it's true. Some of it isn't, but some of it's true. It is true. We can see a lot of stuff and gather a lot of information in a lot of places. But at the end of the day, you still can't see everything all the time. There just isn't enough equipment. So intelligence agencies, governments, whoever, they need to prioritize. They need to design mission requirements and balance them against the collection requirements to determine courses of action. They need to make priorities for these things. So they look at it by saying, there's 5 things we want to accomplish, but I have to be able to find intelligence or evidence to support the 5 things I'm looking to do. But I simply don't have enough people, I don't have enough sensors, I don't have enough equipment to gather all the information that I would need to accomplish these 5 things, so I have to create a priority. And creating the priority list is a challenge in and of itself, especially since you don't know where all of the things are that you're looking for. So you're going to spend time making an assessment, sending equipment and sensors to a certain place, confirming and denying whether what you're looking for is actually there. And if it isn't there, then you got to go somewhere else. And so you've already spent that time. So there's more time. Now you have to reprioritize again, and on the process goes. Now, clearly, the better you are at assessing priorities, assessing a battle space, and determining where you're going to lay your sensors and you're going to direct your assets, the better you're going to be. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. Unfortunately, in the most challenging times, and the best practice really comes in actual combat. But it's just impossible to see everything, okay? You simply can't take all of your cool stuff and research every building in Gaza to find everyone. It just doesn't work that way. So in scenarios like this, where Israel has access to advanced technologies, they still aren't capable of finding every needle in a haystack. Therefore, the negotiations at this point are key. They're no doubt conducting assessments, identifying the most likely locations, looking at patterns of movement to find these key hotspots. They're using what we call doctrinal templates, which is like typical standards of operation of what Hamas would typically do, historical examples. Nonetheless, intelligence collection is as much an art as it is a science. Okay, enough of that for right now. That's your answer as to why somebody in Israeli leadership can't just pick up a magic wand and say, well, we can find all these hostages, let's just go get them. Another reason why Israel is trying to negotiate for a ceasefire This one is a bit more speculative and political. The IDF is even downplaying this report a little, is the rumor that the U.S. was considering withholding a batch of weapons if Israel didn't cancel its planned operations into Rafah. Now, as I had said, Rafah being the last large population center in Gaza to, be cleared, if you will, down in the south. The reports had stated that the U.S. was willing to withhold 6,500 JDAMs. So this is the Joint Direct Attack Munition. It's basically a package that you put on a dumb bomb to make it smart, GPS package. And what the U.S. calls the Mark 84, which is 2,000-pound bombs, and the Mark 82, which are 500-pound bombs. But both of these are, quote, dumb bombs. And so they would need those JDAM packages in order to make them smart, right? Is it a possibility that the U.S. was looking to withhold this if Israel wasn't conducting operations in Rafah like they wanted? Certainly. It's not something the U.S. hasn't done in the past. And even just as I went to go record this today, I saw in the media that U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin even admitted that there was a, quote, pause, end quote. Now, that's diplomatic language. What does a pause really mean? Were they withholding? Were they not? Were they just telling him whatever, right? You could speculate on your own what that actually meant. But at least he did come out and say there was a pause. So there is some credibility to this reporting. So take it for what it's worth. But there's no lack of reporting, though, indicating President Biden's anger at Prime Minister Netanyahu's intransigence, at least that's what I think the president will call it, regarding civilian casualties, which at this point was well over 30,000. Okay. Now, why is this, just as an aside, why is this such a challenge for the president at this point, right? The United States is a staunch ally of Israel. We have been ever since Israel claimed independence in 1948. And for obvious reasons, they're an ally in the region for us. However, the political environment in the United States, as you've seen with the protests across campuses over the last few weeks, puts the president in a tough position because it does look to some people that Israel's acting a bit heavy-handed. I'm not saying that that is necessarily true or untrue. I understand how urban operations are conducted, and I understand that when the enemy uses civilians as fodder and shields and they hide them in hospitals, that you're going to have civilian casualties. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, President Biden still needs to be reelected. He would like to be reelected. And regardless of whether the American people protesting on campuses understand the truth or not, he needs to be able to still engage them so they will vote for him. So he has to balance this relationship he has with Netanyahu. He cannot blanketly support everything Israel does, but at the same time, he understands the complexity of the environment and he understands what needs to be done to eradicate these terrorists, because that's what Hamas is, eradicate these terrorists that are terrorizing their own people in Palestine and others. And so he's walking a fine line. So he has said that he would like to see Prime Minister Netanyahu operate in a certain way as he goes through Rafah, as he begins to clear Rafah, to try and minimize at every opportunity the amount of civilian casualties that could exist. It's not unheard of for the U.S. to say, I'm going to withhold support, whether there be money or weapons, unless you do it my way. Now, you could argue and say, well, that's not fair, right? Then everyone in the world has to operate the way the U.S. does. But in this instance, it is. Those weapons, that money that the U.S. Congress has decided to give to another country is paid for by the American people. That's American taxpayer money. And so therefore, the American people, in a way, have a right to say that we're going to use, or you should use these weapons in a certain way because they're ours. And if you want to use them, you're going to use them our way. If you don't want to use them our way, you can't have them. And so there is validity to that part of the process. Now, back to what I was saying, that President Biden being upset about 30,000 at a very least. Let me just say, it's not the time to argue how many civilians are actually dead, how many casualties there are. Okay, the numbers are what they are. Now, I'm not going to have the discussion right now as to whether the numbers of civilians are correct or not. The U.S. has already come out and said that they do take some of the casualty estimates from Hamas and add them into their calculations. However, they have other ways of determining how many casualties there may be. And the U.S. has already said that what Hamas has said, what Hamas claims, is close. Just put it that way. Okay, so not going to have that discussion at this point, but just to understand, I think it's fair to say there have been tens of thousands of casualties in Gaza. Okay, now I can understand also politically from the Israeli side of the house why the IDF would want to be downplaying that. They wouldn't want to admit that they being the Israeli political leadership, is really in a position to have to do everything the U.S. says whenever they want, right? I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu is well aware that this is American taxpayer money and weapons, and so he's going to have to use those weapons as he's told, but he looks pretty weak domestically if he just waves a white flag and says, yes, Mr. Biden, whatever you say, right? So he's saving a little face. The IDF is coming out and saying, that's not necessarily true. I'm sure there's some political conversations behind the scenes where the Americans agreed to say, well, we're going to kind of admit it, so we'll call it a pause, and then you can kind of deny it, and then we'll all kind of get a win-win out of this. Those things certainly do happen. But anyways, I'm not shocked that they're downplaying the rumor. We'll have to see what else hits the media and what other stuff comes out in the next couple of days. As I said, I'm just recording here on May 8th, and I'm sure there's more to come. So ultimately, in terms of the ceasefire, the question is, do I think it will get done? And at this point in time, I would say yes, in some manner. You know, there's mounting pressure from the Biden administration and potentially Qatar pushing Hamas leadership out, and therefore cutting off Hamas's voice. So I think potentially something gets done. Again, what exactly happens, that remains to be seen. Some of the delay and the fact that this hasn't even happened yet, I'm sure, has to do with Hamas's recent attack on the Kerem Shalom border crossing point, which is way down in the deep southeast of Gaza, which ended up killing 3 Israeli soldiers last week. That doesn't help matters, right? And this isn't some information warfare event either. Hamas came out immediately and claimed responsibility for the attack. So you'd ask yourself, if they're looking for a ceasefire, why that was. Well, they wanted to give the impression by attacking the IDF directly that the ceasefire agreement they were going to potentially agree to was a capitulation of Israel's and not some long discussed negotiation, right? So in other words, Hamas was acting like the amateurs that they are. They were trying to show to their own supporters that, hey, I went and attacked this border crossing in southern Israel, and then oops, look, 2 hours later, Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to a ceasefire. I wonder why. Come on, it's that's silly stuff. That's elementary business. Clearly, no one's going to believe that. I mean, maybe some knuckleheads in Tehran are cheering and they believe that nonsense, but the real players that are having an effect on what's happening in Gaza clearly don't have that, don't hold to that nonsense. So just another indicator that Hamas is really just an amateur organization, at least when it comes to strategic diplomacy. The attack did nothing but just upset the process and angered Israel and doesn't help anybody move forward. So it's just going to stretch things out. It's kind of like the type of move a child would make when like tripping a kid in high school as they walked away, right? Maybe it's funny for like 3 seconds until you get your mouth smacked and then you're suspended for a month. It doesn't help you, right? That's kind of the position we're in right now. It didn't derail the negotiations, but we'll see how it turns out. Like I said, I foresee some deal coming that puts a pause on direct combat operations, an increase in humanitarian assistance, politicians claiming victory of a quote-unquote peace process may last a couple of weeks, but I don't think it lasts. If it's decided that it'll be 6, I don't think it lasts 6. And because Hamas is eventually going to get tired of the ceasefire and it'll find an opportunity to attack Israel and break the deal early, and operations will resume. Will resume at that point. History tells us that Hamas is unlikely to just sit around and wait for the day when the timer goes off, and then Israel just remains or just resumes its operations. Right? Hamas is going to want to seize the initiative, if you will, and they're not going to wait for the official end. They're going to break the deal because everyone knows that they would act in that kind of manner anyway. So what do they have to lose? So they'll break the deal. They'll attack Israel in some manner, and operations will resume. Israel can't do the same thing. Israel has to be the bigger person. They have to act as the mature player. And so if Prime Minister Netanyahu signs a deal and says 6 weeks, he's going to have to stick to 6 weeks. It's just the position he's in. Now, so if you're listening to this podcast, then you're likely well informed of why we're in the position of even having a potential ceasefire today at all, right? It all stems from, at least in the near term, in the short term here, Hamas conducting that surprise attack on Israel on October 7th, which ended up killing 1,400 people, many hostages, hundreds of hostages were taken, obviously mostly Israelis, but there were foreigners, Americans were in there, leading Israel to respond very, very severely within a couple of weeks and vowing to rid Gaza of Hamas completely. Right? Gaza being the smaller of the two quote-unquote occupied territories, the West Bank being much larger up to the northeast, and getting rid of Hamas for good. Ever since Israel entered Gaza, they've been systematically clearing Gaza, if you will, from the north to the south. They did have some operations conducted in the east at the same time. It wasn't just a one avenue of approach, if you will, from the north. It was kind of a dual thing. But either way, strategically, they're looking to kind of rid Gaza of Hamas from the north down through the south, the last population center being Rafah in the south, where they are currently today. Israel has yet to declare, regardless of the ceasefire, when they are going to end their operations here. Now, as we do on this podcast, we link today's foreign affairs news and geostrategic concerns, military conflict with their historical events. So let's do that now regarding Hamas and Israel, at least in the last couple of decades. We don't have the time today to go into the deep history of Hamas. The story is too long. It's actually very interesting, but we'll have to save that for another time. But let's at least kind of talk about why we're here between these two organizations. All right, so a quick summary. Hamas, that's not actually a name, it's an acronym. And it's an acronym for a name I'm going to butcher, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. I often apologize for mispronouncing names because I'm just not great at that. But in this instance, I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize to Hamas that I butchered their name. But it stands for like the Islamic Resistance Movement, basically. It was founded by a guy by the name of Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. He was a Palestinian cleric, former refugee, who became an activist for the Muslim Brotherhood after dedicating his early life to Islamic scholarship in Cairo. Now, if you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization, a foundational organization, really, that started in the early 20th century in Egypt, and there are a lot of foundational ties between the Muslim Brotherhood movement and many terror organizations that exist today, to include Al-Qaeda and all of its operations in Afghanistan against Russia, and then 9/11 and the rest of it. So there's a lot of Islamic fundamentalist doctrine that flows from the Muslim Brotherhood's early existence. So Yassin is in Egypt. He took his show on the road, so to speak, and established a political arm of the Brotherhood in Gaza in 1987. Now, as I said earlier, Gaza is one of the two Palestinian-controlled lands outside of Israel's borders, and referred to as the occupied territories. That's an argument in and of itself, okay? And the other is the West Bank. These two areas specifically were created after there was many conflicts, but we can highlight really three of the more primary conflicts since Israel existence, since Israel first claimed independence, rather. So the first was in 48, when Israel did declare independence and had to defend itself against Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, themselves just young countries born out of 1918 and post-World War I timeframe. So there's a UN agreement in 1947 to create two different states after World War II. There's no agreement in 47. The Palestinian leadership doesn't agree. 48 comes, and in 48, Israel declares independence. Literally the next day, Israel as a country, now officially a country, at least as recognized by the UN, or at least as recognized by the United States, rather, is attacked by those 5 countries. So that's the first conflict. Then you have the next one in 1967, which is famously called the Six-Day War, when Israel took control of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and Gaza, which was at one point under Egyptian control. And they did this in a peremptory strike to defend what was surely going to be an Egyptian invasion. So there was intelligence that was available to Israel and its new allies at the time, that Egypt was most certainly, there's a lot of reasons for this, but Egypt was most certainly going to attack into Israel. And so Israel preemptively attacked Egypt instead, and in 6 days completely wiped out Egypt. They did this by really just eviscerating their air force to start things off. They gained air superiority, and that was it. And then in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria again invaded and were again defeated by Israel, it took a lot longer than 6 days at this point, but nonetheless, eventually Israel gives back the Sinai, even though what they say is they took it, if you will, fair and square through defending themselves after being attacked. But they give back the Sinai nonetheless, but they didn't give back Gaza. And so Gaza ended up being, a quote unquote occupied territory because it was at once Egypt's. Now it's mainly populated by Palestinians, but it's under the political control and purview of Israel, as was the West Bank. And that was the case specifically for the West Bank until today. In 1987, the same year Yassin brought his political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, to Gaza, was also the beginning of the First Intifada. And the First Intifada, or uprising, the best way to describe it, happened when an Israeli truck slammed into a civilian vehicle that ended up killing 4 Palestinians. So this led to this uprising of Palestinians against the Israeli government and led to years and years and years of fighting until eventually that intifada ended in 1993 with the Oslo Accords. This was negotiations that were mediated by President Clinton, and some decisions were made about who goes where and what Israel can hold and what they don't hold and where they can build and where they can't build. And nonetheless, the first intifada ended in 93. There was a second one, and that came in 2002 after Israel launched an Operation Defensive Shield into the West Bank and Gaza after a suicide bomb killed 30 people inside of Israel. So there's history there. If you go in and you attack Israel and you kill a bunch of Israeli civilians, then Israel is going to respond. So they responded with this defensive shield operation, and it led to another 5 years of fighting. So the first intifada lasted much longer. The second one, 5 years. The key here, even though it lasted from 2002 to 2007, the key year here is 2005 as it relates to Hamas and Gaza. And that was the year that Israel decided to pull out of Gaza and leave it to its own devices, if you will, and leave Gaza to be operated, to be lived in by the Palestinians and controlled by themselves. So they did. But there's some nuance here. So before 2005, following the wars we just discussed, Israel controlled Gaza from the inside out, if you will. It had control over everything that happened within Gaza and outside of Gaza, everything that moved in and out. Massive security presence, as you might imagine, didn't sit well with the Palestinians. I'm not here to discuss whether the occupation was good or bad, warranted or not. Just we're going to deal with the fact that it just did happen, okay? But in 2005, as I had mentioned, under immense international pressure, Israel agreed to leave Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. Now, this is the internationally recognized political entity that was representing the Palestinians on a world stage. It was politically connected, almost an umbrella organization under the PLO, which is a whole separate conversation. But PLO is really not a thing anymore. It's the Palestinian Authority. Those are the political representatives, okay? And Israel pulled out in 2005 and said, okay, PA, you are the political entity. You got to hold some elections. The problem was that as soon as Israel pulled out in '05, Hamas, a pretty violent terror organization operating differently than the PA, wrested control of the small piece of territory from the PA and has been in charge ever since. Now, like I said, there were elections held post-withdrawal, and even many analysts considered potentially fair in a relative sense. I wouldn't say they were fair like, elections in Germany, but fair nonetheless. And Hamas, because it played itself up as a legitimate political entity that was going to provide security and jobs and food and welfare for the Palestinian people in Gaza, many Palestinians voted for them to be their political leaders. That's why you often hear in the media that, or you sometimes hear in the media, Hamas isn't really just a terror organization. They do provide food and water and other things. You just call them terrorists because you don't like them. Right. And in fact, although labeled a terror organization technically by many countries, to include the U.S., they weren't recognized by all Western wealthy countries as a terror organization until many years later. In fact, at 2021, maybe 2022, the UK didn't recognize them as a terror group until then, because technically they were the democratically elected leaders of Gaza. I mean, Palestinians said we like Hamas, and they voted for them. And again, international bodies said, I think the elections were relatively fair. I guess they're the leaders, right? They are the legitimate leadership. Think of it like North Korea. The international community may not approve of the system. They may kill millions of their own people, but they are the recognized government. That's who we deal with diplomatically. Anyway, after Israel left Gaza in 2005, which is true, going as far as even digging up graves of Israelis who had died from living in Gaza forever, to make sure that they pulled every single person out of Gaza. They did control the imports and the exports and all the comings and goings of the Gazans. And so that's the nuance that I was making reference to earlier. It is true that Israel left, but they didn't really allow Gazans to live in the way that you would think a free country would. All right. And this is where we get the story and the phrase of the quote unquote open air prison camp. Like, Gazans can do pretty much whatever they want to do from within Gaza, but they can't leave, and other people can't come in. Right. Now, clearly Israel finds open air prison camp to be a pejorative. I'm not even going to jump into that, but there's logic behind why some people would call it that, okay? I've actually never set foot in Gaza, although I've been to the Middle East plenty of times, and I haven't been to Gaza in particular, so I'm not going to make a claim as to whether that's technically true or not true from my own perspective. I can only speculate based on my reading and people that I learned from, but either way, that's what it's called by some. It did lend credence to that idea, though, based on how Israel controls from the outside. So, and let me give you an example why. Israel uses, if you didn't know this, Israel uses a colored ID badge process for Palestinians and does restrict their movement in and out of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza on kind of a tiered basis. Okay? For example, if a Palestinian lives in the West Bank, they can travel to Gaza, but a Gazan can't travel back to the West Bank or Jerusalem, right? If a West Bank female marries a Gazan male, the female must move to Gaza because the Gazan would be restricted from living in the West Bank, okay? These people living at this tier are called green card holders. They have green IDs, literally. Blue ID holders, these are Palestinians living in Jerusalem, not yet Israeli citizens, but living in Jerusalem. They're free to travel back and forth to the West Bank, but are forbidden from going to Gaza. And if they ever find their way into Gaza, they can't come back out, right? And I say it's a tiered system because basically Jerusalem Palestinians have like the most freedom. Then you have the West Bank denizens who have somewhat less, and then the Gazans, which practically have none. Now, Israel will tell you that because Hamas runs Gaza, it is nearly impossible to separate Hamas terrorists from innocent Gazans, not my words, that they need to restrict movement of those living there. It's only for security purposes. If you look back at all the times Israel was invaded since its independence in 48, and the intifadas, random bus bombings, suicide bombings, you could see where there's logic there from the Israeli side of the house. Okay. But at the same time, as an innocent Palestinian who just happened to be born in Gaza City and can't leave ever, you can understand the idea of why it felt like being held captive, right? It's a terrible situation all around. And this subtopic alone can help shed light onto why this problem is so intransient, okay? I've made a couple of short videos on this, and I won't get too far into it, but there are so many truths and realities on both sides that finding common ground is like nearly impossible, right? Strip away your cynicism for a minute and when thinking about this, and admit that some of the smartest people in the last 100 years have been trying to find a solution to this problem without being able to do so. Like I said, strip away your cynicism for those thinking to yourselves right now, well, no one really wants peace because blah, blah, blah. That's not helpful. But just, if you're looking at it without a cynic's lens, this is a challenge. And it's a challenge because there are truths on both sides of the house. Now, as you might imagine, there's way more to the story. And there's a deep history between the Israelis and the Palestinians and what happened in the West Bank, what happened in Gaza, the Oslo Accords, all of the things. But for our purposes here today, just know that the conflict specifically between Hamas and Israel really started in 87 when Yassin brought Hamas as a political entity or a political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood to Gaza in 87. You had the first intifada, and ever since, you've had this very, very strict security environment in Gaza. Then you had 2005 when the Israelis, quote unquote, pulled out, but then still controlled the outer area, monitoring everything coming and going, and then not even allowing certain Palestinians to leave and go there, right? This continues to anger the Palestinians who live there, and then as you might imagine, Hamas as well. But again, very basic rundown. So tensions have been high, really since the beginning of Israel's existence, as I said. But that leads us to the question of October 7th, specifically. Why the attack that day, and which is what led Israel to invade Gaza, to root out Hamas in the first place, and then puts us in the position where we're having these negotiations for a ceasefire. I've touched on this before in previous episodes. I've also made some videos on this topic in particular, but I think it's worth going over again as we talk about this ceasefire. First, we need to remember that Hamas is not an independent organization. And what I mean by that, I should probably say not a self-sustaining organization. It's independent in the sense that it lives and operates in Gaza and it kind of does what it wants to do. But you know, it is influenced from the outside, but it's really more like it's not self-sustaining. It is supported by an array of wealthy donors from across the world, as well as the Iranian regime in Tehran, because these people all hate Israel. Now, and there's no better way to explain it, right? Like Hamas, many politicians in Iran, and many people across the world literally hate Israel, and they no longer want it to exist as a country. They want it utterly destroyed. That's not hyperbole on my part. That is dead truth. Nonetheless, in terms of Hamas, anytime you take money from someone else on a repeated basis, you're beholden to them in some fashion, right? Whether you're a political regime in Tehran or you're a wealthy donor in Saudi Arabia, if you're continuously providing money to somebody, you're going to want to have them operate in a way that suits your fancy. And so Hamas understands that, and so is therefore influenced by outside entities to operate in certain ways. Okay? And the biggest concern for us in our discussion right now is really what Iran does and how they support, because they have the most money. Clearly, they're a country, so they have the most. And their support comes from Tehran via Hezbollah, which Hamas is beholden to in some fashion. And Hezbollah, which is a whole nother conversation, but Hamas gets their training and their military logistics, a lot of their money, specifically from Hezbollah, which is an older organization and a more robust and more capable, really, organization. And Iran specifically plays into the October 7th attack because there are theories that Iran was in some manner behind the planning itself. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true. What I can say is that the U.S. has not claimed they have that intel. And I don't know why the U.S. would say that they did if they didn't, or vice versa. They blame Iran for stuff all the time, so I don't know why they would lie about that. And they don't have a smoking gun, if you will, that says Iran told Hamas to conduct the attack on October 7th. And Hamas has every reason to do it on their own anyways, at least from a tactical perspective. So now, operationally, it is true Hamas couldn't have pulled this operation off without the training and resources from Iran via Hezbollah, but that doesn't equate to the attack being directed by Iran on that day at that time and in that manner, right? Iran, understand, has been put in a tough spot already, and no matter what they say, they're not interested in a direct war with Israel. They really don't want it. Just like Russia really doesn't want, and China really doesn't want a direct conflict with NATO, Iran doesn't want a direct conflict with Israel. Iran had to have known that killing 1,400 Israelis would have triggered a monster response, especially at a time when Israel is as politically conservative as they've ever been. It seems to me that Hamas, being the amateur terror organization that it is, pulled off a pretty clever stunt during a time of political upheaval for Netanyahu. He's dealing with that judicial overhaul problem. And because they're in a position where they're mad right now that the world is not paying attention to them. And this comes particularly as a result of the Abraham Accords. And, the Palestinians need, well, let me say that differently. Hamas needs attention in order for them to continue to garner support, both financially and militarily. And so when the world is shifting to supporting new relationships between Israel and Arab states, then it would behoove Hamas to take an action where everybody starts looking towards them. As I had mentioned, another reason, the political turmoil for Netanyahu, likely a factor. Shifting the balance of power in Tel Aviv from the judicial branch to the executive branch, wildly unpopular. There were protests all over the place for many months. And there was even a point where reservists in the military were claiming that they would not support Netanyahu in any further operations. They were going to quit the reserves and other things. But so, in a bit of irony, the attack on October 7th actually unified the reservists and everyone else in the military under Netanyahu as a response to the Hamas attack. But nonetheless, there was confusion and issues within Israel domestically, and so the time was ripe to attack, at least from a tactical perspective. There is some conversation about the third potential reason, and that is that it was the 50-year anniversary, off by just one day, of the Yom Kippur War in 1953. Symbolism does play a role in operations like these, so, they could have certainly picked another day. Al-Qaeda picked September 11th for a historical Islamic event, so, there was some play into the fact that October 7th was the actual day. And then there are some realities that happened that speak more to why the attack was successful, more so than why it necessarily happened at that time. And the first was that there's this capability that not only Israel has, the United States and some of the other countries do that, where they have tethered balloons that, the media calls them spy balloons, but basically they are like a balloon-like structure filled with hydrogen tethered to the ground, and they have certain sensors on there. Israel had a handful of these. I believe at the time there were 7 located along the border between Israel and Gaza. And at the time of the attack, 3 of them were down, and 1 of them was shot down on the morning of the attack. So had less than 50% of the ability to see the battle space as they had set it up. That was a concern, or that was a problem. Then Hamas had pretty good training and was using, for example, they were using coded language in their radio communication. So even though Israel was able to determine that something was happening, they had no idea exactly what, because they couldn't understand what they were talking about. So the collection was good in the sense that they were intercepting radio communications, but if you don't know what the content is, it's almost meaningless. Additionally, the morning started off with a rocket barrage. Hundreds and hundreds of rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel. And you might say to yourself, well, that's an indicator of something that happens in the future, but not necessarily, because Hamas shoots at Israel all of the time. So in fact, it could have worked in the opposite way, and that the rockets almost lulled the Israelis into a sense of normalcy, if you will, where, well, we always get shot with rockets, so here's just another day, and it didn't necessarily trigger some greater defensive response in thinking it was somehow different. So, the question was asked, and it remains, and it'll be decided or answered, if you will, into the future when the operations are done. But many are asking, was it an intelligence failure on Israel's part? There's video out there of Hamas practicing with their little gliders, and that conducting these pre-operational. They had these training areas designed like the kibbutzes that they were going to plan on clearing. And the problem with that is that Hamas was constantly doing that. And so it isn't something that's necessarily new. And if Israel is always looking at Hamas practicing, which they were, how do you determine that one day is more important than the other, right? Well, how do you determine that such indicators are, showing you something different for this day as opposed to another day? It's hard to do. I'm not saying that Israel, if it conducts an investigation, won't determine that there were times they could have identified the threat, just like we did in 9/11. We did the huge congressional commission afterwards, and they wrote the big book, and they determined that there were many, many faults in the system, cracks that we had to fill, and that there were many times along the way we could have probably stopped 9/11 if we did A, B, and C. Israel's probably going to come up with the same thing. Geez, if the balloon wasn't down, if this unit was over here, if whatever it is, then potentially they'll be able to come back and say, yeah, it might have been an intelligence failure. What I don't see happening is the government of Israel, whenever they do release this information, saying to themselves, no, it wasn't an intelligence failure. They're just better than us, right? That's not going to happen. So it's likely that the systems they had in place, just failed them that day. There's so much more to learn about that going forward that, it'll come out someday and we'll learn. So, okay. So here we are at the time of the potential ceasefire. Starts with, go all the way back into 48. Israel claims independence. They're attacked the next day. We have the wars of 67 and 73. Eventually, Israel takes control over Gaza. It's running the security environment within Gaza and outside of Gaza until 2005 when they pull out. However, Hamas is still operating within Gaza, and they determine that October 7th is going to be their day for some of the reasons that we discussed. Israel responds, which is no shock after killing 1,400 people and taking hundreds of hostages. Operations have been ongoing for months, and now here we are at a potential ceasefire. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if the ceasefire actually is, agreed to, signed, whatever language you want to use. And then if Hamas actually breaks the deal, as I suspect that they will. Okay, thanks. Thanks for coming and joining me today, having this discussion about, the hottest topic in the foreign affairs world over the last week. I look forward to all of you joining us next week as we have our first interview. So it'll be our 10th episode, but our first interview of the podcast. And we're going to be talking to a senior military leader who had just spent some time in the Horn of Africa. And we're going to talk specifically about what China's doing there from an intelligence perspective, how it affects the rest of the world, how it affects the region, how it affects the rest of the world, what are they doing there, and what were his experiences while we were there. So it'll be a really good episode, and it'll tie in nicely to our previous episode when we discussed Antony Blinken in China and how we're turning to the table having some discussion. So I look forward to that. As always, you can email me questions, comments, concerns, John Moloch at headlinesandhistory.com. You can catch me on social, YouTube, Instagram at Headlines in History. And I look forward to talking with you all next week.